The ocean floor holds more than 2 million shipwrecks, each one a frozen moment from history. This video covers 25 discoveries that overturned long-held historical assumptions, forcing experts to rethink trade routes, technology, and daily life. You will see how textbooks were wrong about the past, from a 2,000-year-old computer to a pirate ship that rewrote lore. What hidden truths still lie beneath the waves? A sponge diver named surfaced with a strange bronze object in 1982 off the southern coast of Turkey. That moment pulled a forgotten world back into the light. Archaeologists soon identified the wreck as a late Bronze Age merchant vessel from the 14th century BC, resting on the seabed near. But what they found inside shattered the old image of ancient economies as isolated or small-scale. This ship carried a staggering cargo: 10 tons of copper ingots from Cyprus, a ton of tin from somewhere in Central Asia, raw glass ingots from Mesopotamia, elephant ivory from Africa, ostrich eggshells, Baltic amber, and even a golden scarab bearing the name of an Egyptian queen. The vessel itself, about 15 meters long, had been a floating marketplace connecting Egypt, Canaan, Cyprus, and the Aegean. Historians had long assumed that Bronze Age trade was regional and limited, perhaps coastal bartering between neighboring villages. The wreck proved otherwise. It showed that merchants navigated open seas, swapped goods across thousands of kilometers, and operated within a sophisticated network of supply and demand. Using Dendrochronology, the science of tree ring dating, researchers dated a piece of the ship's hull to around 1306 BC. Ceramic analysis of the storage jars confirmed that the journey ended in that narrow time window. The precision astonished scholars. This was not a random drift of goods, but a carefully orchestrated voyage, carrying luxury items alongside industrial raw materials. The wreck forced a complete rethink of Bronze Age society. It revealed that kings and merchants were deeply interconnected long before the classical era. And it raised a quieter but equally powerful question. If this one ship carried so much, how many other vessels like it still lie undiscovered, waiting to change what we know? The discovery did not just revise history. It opened a door to an even older mystery, one involving a machine so advanced that it seemed to belong to a different age entirely. In 1900, Greek sponge divers found something far stranger than pearls. Near the small island of, they stumbled upon a Roman-era shipwreck loaded with marble statues and pottery. But among the treasures lay a single lump of corroded bronze, cracked and encrusted with marine growth. It looked like a piece of trash. The divers brought it up anyway. For decades, that lump sat in a museum in Athens, ignored, because nobody could make sense of it. It was only in the 1950s that a British historian named Price took a serious look. What he saw inside the broken crust astonished him. Using X-rays, Price identified a complex system of gear wheels, interlocking teeth, and precisely cut plates. This was not a piece of decoration. It was a mechanical calculator designed to track the movements of the sun, the moon, and the planets. Historians had always assumed that such sophisticated gear technology did not appear until the 14th century, when European clockmakers began building astronomical clocks. But the mechanism predated those clocks by over 1,000 years. It was built around 100 BC in the Hellenistic Greek world. The level of engineering involved is staggering. The device contains at least 30 gear wheels, with teeth cut at exact angles to produce specific ratios. It could predict lunar eclipses, calculate the dates of the Olympic Games, and even track the irregular orbit of the moon using a pin and slot mechanism that mimicked planetary motion. Nothing like it appears anywhere else in the archaeological record for more than a millennium. That single artifact forced historians to completely revise their understanding of ancient technology. The Greeks were not just philosophers and sculptors. They were master machinists who understood differential gears and precision metalworking. Why did such knowledge vanish? Why did it take European civilization over 1,000 years to reinvent the same concepts? Those questions remain unanswered. And as recently as the early 2000s, researchers using advanced X-ray tomography, a technique that creates three-dimensional images of the internal structure, discovered new features engraved on the mechanism. Inscriptions describing the motions of the planets and a dial for tracking the date of the Panhellenic Games had been hidden beneath corrosion. The mechanism is still revealing its secrets. It stands as a reminder that the past could be far more advanced than we ever imagined. And if this solitary device was an outlier, a freak survival from a lost tradition, then the next discovery in this list proved that ancient seafarers were not just passengers on the currents. They were engineers, builders, and innovators on a massive scale. But before that astonishing device surfaced, another discovery had already begun to rewrite the story of Bronze Age seafaring. In 1960, a small team of archaeologists and sponge divers working off the coast of Turkey at Cape found a late Bronze Age wreck that dated to around 1200 BC. At first glance, its cargo seemed modest: a pile of copper ingots shaped like ox hides, some stone tools, and fragments of pottery. The ship itself was much smaller than the vessel that would be found 22 years later in the same region. For the archaeologists who studied the wreck in the 1960s, the evidence suggested a simple, local trading venture, perhaps a single merchant moving goods between nearby islands. That interpretation fit the old view of the Bronze Age as a time when trade was mostly coastal, limited, and disconnected. But then something unexpected happened. The discovery prompted a complete reevaluation of underwater archaeology as a serious scientific discipline. Up until that point, most shipwreck excavations were treasure-hunting operations with little attention to context. The team, led by the pioneer George Bass, conducted the first systematic excavation of an ancient wreck using modern archaeological methods. They mapped every artifact's position, recorded every layer of sediment, and preserved timbers when possible. That approach proved that sunken ships are not random piles of relics. They are time capsules that preserve the exact moment a vessel sank, and every object's location tells a story about how the crew lived and worked. When the wreck appeared 2 decades later with its massive cargo, historians had to revisit the evidence with fresh eyes. Together, the two wrecks painted a striking picture. The ship carried copper from Cyprus and tin from distant sources, as well as scrap metal and broken tools, suggesting that even a modest vessel could participate in a vast network. The ship, with its luxury goods from 3 continents, showed the upper end of that same system. The conclusion was inescapable. The Eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age was not a collection of isolated villages. It was a connected world, where merchants transported industrial raw materials and prestige goods over hundreds of kilometers, using standardized weights and measures. The wreck also changed how historians viewed the role of the sea itself. It was no longer a barrier but a highway, one that linked the great civilizations of Egypt, the Near East, and the Aegean into a single economic sphere. That humble cargo of ingots and tools turned out to be the key that unlocked an entire era of global exchange, and it was only the beginning of what the deep sea had to reveal. More than 2 decades later, another discovery off the same coast would dwarf the find. 1982, a Turkish sponge diver named surfaced with a strange bronze object near a rocky promontory in southern Turkey. That single piece of metal set off a chain reaction that would force historians to tear up their old models of Bronze Age trade and start again. The wreck that archaeologists uncovered was a late Bronze Age merchant ship from the 14th century BC, resting on the seabed at a depth of about 45 meters. But it was the cargo that truly stunned everyone. The vessel carried 10 tons of copper ingots from Cyprus, a ton of tin from distant sources likely in Central Asia, raw glass ingots from Mesopotamia, elephant ivory from Africa, ostrich eggshells, Baltic amber, and even a golden scarab bearing the name of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti. Altogether, the cargo represented goods from at least 3 continents. This was not a local fishing boat making a short hop between islands. It was a floating warehouse on a carefully planned long-distance voyage. To confirm the date, researchers turned to two scientific methods. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, allowed them to analyze a piece of the ship's hull and match the growth patterns to known chronologies. That placed the timbers around the year 1306 BC, give or take a few years. Meanwhile, ceramic typology, the analysis of pottery styles and forms, cross-checked that date by comparing the storage jars and drinking cups found on board with known examples from the Eastern Mediterranean. Both methods agreed perfectly. The ship had sunk during the late 14th century BC. But what did that mean for history? Before, many scholars assumed that Bronze Age economies were essentially isolated, that each region produced what it needed and traded only sporadically with neighbors. The sheer volume and variety of goods on this single vessel shattered that idea. The copper and tin alone, the raw materials for making bronze, had traveled separate paths across hundreds of kilometers before meeting in the same hold. The glass ingots showed a technology that was being shared across borders. The luxury items proved that royal courts as far apart as Egypt and Mycenae were connected by a web of exchange that relied on skilled navigators and standardized weights. The wreck did not just revise history. It set a new standard for understanding just how connected the ancient world really was, and it raised an enduring question. If one ship carried this much, what else is still hidden beneath the waves that same year? A corroded lump of bronze salvaged from a Roman shipwreck would challenge everything historians believed about ancient technology. In 1900, sponge divers working near the Greek island of discovered a massive 1st century BC wreck loaded with marble statues and amphorae. Among the treasures, they brought up a cracked greenish object encrusted with marine growth. It sat in a museum for decades, dismissed as unremarkable scrap. Then in the 1950s, a British historian named Price used X-rays to peer inside the crust. What he saw forced a complete re-evaluation of ancient Greek capabilities. The object contained a complex system of interlocking bronze gear wheels, at least 30 of them, cut with teeth so precise they could produce specific astronomical ratios. This was no fragment of decoration. It was a mechanical calculator designed to track the motions of the sun, the moon, and the planets. The device even employed a differential gear, a mechanism that would not appear again in European technology until the 14th century. Historians had long assumed that such sophisticated engineering lay far beyond the reach of classical craftsmen, but the mechanism proved otherwise. Built around 100 BC, it could predict lunar eclipses, calculate the dates of the Olympic Games, and even model the irregular orbit of the moon using a pin and slot system that mimicked elliptical motion. Nothing like it exists anywhere in the archaeological record for more than 1,000 years. The device is so advanced that some researchers initially suspected a hoax, but repeated studies using advanced X-ray tomography, a technique that creates three-dimensional images of internal structures, have confirmed its authenticity and revealed new features. Inscriptions hidden beneath corrosion describe planetary motions and a dial for tracking the 4-year cycle of the Panhellenic Games. Each new scan unlocks another layer of function. The mechanism stands as a solitary technological outlier, a brilliant flash of lost knowledge. If it could exist, what else might have been forgotten? The next discovery would show that the same era produced feats of naval engineering that were equally ahead of their time. In 1960, a small team of archaeologists set out to excavate a shipwreck near Cape, a rocky promontory on the southern coast of Turkey. That expedition did not set out to rewrite history, but it ended up doing exactly that. The wreck itself was a late Bronze Age merchant vessel dating to around 1200 BC. Its cargo consisted mainly of copper ingots shaped like ox hides, along with stone tools, scrap metal, and fragments of pottery. At first glance, this seemed like the remains of a modest local trader, perhaps moving goods between nearby islands in a simple coastal network. The archaeologists who studied the site in the 1960s interpreted it that way because that was what the prevailing view of the Bronze Age allowed. They saw a small ship with a limited cargo and they assumed the voyages were short and the contacts were shallow. But the real breakthrough was not the cargo itself. It was the method. Until Cape, most shipwreck excavations were little more than treasure hunts. Divers would grab interesting objects and bring them to the surface, with little regard for where they lay or what lay around them. Context was lost. The team at Cape, led by the pioneering archaeologist George Bass, changed all of that. They conducted the first systematic underwater excavation using the same careful techniques that land archaeologists had used for decades. Every artifact was mapped in place. Every layer of sediment was recorded. Fragments of the hull were preserved and analyzed. The team treated the wreck not as a pile of loot, but as a single, connected site that told one story. That approach became the foundation of modern underwater archaeology. It proved that the seabed could yield the same kind of detailed historical information as a buried city. Years later, when the much larger wreck was discovered in the same region, the Cape site took on a new significance. Researchers realized that the modest cargo of copper ingots and tools was not evidence of small-scale trade. It was part of a vast, organized system of metal redistribution that connected the mines of Cyprus with the workshops of the Eastern Mediterranean. The oxide ingots found at Cape were identical in shape and composition to those found at. The tools and scrap metal showed that even broken goods were recycled across long distances. What had once looked like a simple coastal journey now appeared to be a link in a chain that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. The two wrecks together painted a picture of an interconnected Bronze Age economy that was far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. The legacy of the Cape expedition goes far beyond its own cargo. It established underwater archaeology as a credible scientific discipline. It trained a generation of maritime archaeologists who would go on to excavate the wreck, the mechanism site, and dozens of others. It showed that shipwrecks are not just collections of artifacts. They are time capsules that preserve the exact moment of a disaster, frozen on the. Every ingot, every shard, every splinter of wood holds a clue. And because of the methods developed at Cape, those clues can now be read with remarkable precision. That single excavation opened the door to all the spectacular finds that followed. It proved that the deep sea holds whole chapters of history that have never been written. And it left a powerful question hanging in the water. If this small wreck could change so much, what would the next one reveal in 1967? A sponge diver searching the seabed off the northern coast of Cyprus found something that looked like a pile of ancient jars. He had stumbled onto a shipwreck from the 4th century BC, a Greek merchant vessel that had lain undisturbed for more than 2,000 years. When archaeologists arrived, they discovered that the wreck was exceptionally well preserved. The hull, made of pine and oak, had survived largely intact beneath a protective layer of sand and sea grass. Even the cargo remained in remarkable condition. Hundreds of clay jars called amphorae, still stacked in the hold as they had been on the day the ship went down. And inside some of those jars, researchers found something that made the discovery even more extraordinary: almonds. The seeds had been sealed in the amphorae for over 2, and they were still recognizable. That single detail brought the past into sharp focus. This was not just a pile of relics. It was a snapshot of a working ship, frozen in time with its everyday supplies still on board. The ship, as it became known, measured about 14 meters long. That made it a typical merchant vessel of its era, the kind that carried goods like wine, grain, and oil across the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean. But historians had long assumed that such ships were clumsy, slow, and limited to short hops along the coast. The textbooks described ancient Greek seafaring as timid, hugging the shoreline because the ships could not handle open water. The ship challenged that view in a direct and measurable way. First, the hull itself was a marvel of design. The planks were joined with mortise and tenon joints, a technique that created a strong, flexible shell without relying on an internal skeleton of ribs. That kind of construction produced a vessel that could withstand the stresses of open sea travel. Second, the cargo was stowed with obvious care. The amphorae were arranged in layers with branches of brushwood packed between them to prevent shifting. That showed a sophisticated understanding of weight distribution and the effects of heavy weather. The ship was not a primitive raft. It was a purpose-built cargo carrier, designed by people who knew exactly what they were doing. To test these ideas, researchers built a full-scale replica of the ship in the 1980s. They called it II. They sailed it across the Mediterranean, following reconstructed routes and carrying amphorae filled with water and grain to simulate a real cargo. The results were eye-opening. The replica achieved average speeds of about 4 knots, and under favorable winds it could reach 6 or 7 knots. That matched the speeds recorded by Roman merchant ships centuries later. More importantly, the replica proved that the ship could handle open sea passages. It sailed from Cyprus to Greece, crossing stretches of open water far from land. It could tack against the wind and maneuver in tight spaces. The old image of Greek merchants clinging to the coastline simply did not hold up. The ship showed that even a modest vessel from the 4th century BC was capable of long-distance trade, crossing the Mediterranean with confidence. The implications for ancient economics were significant. Historians had long debated how much trade actually moved by sea and whether it was a marginal activity or a central pillar of the ancient economy. The ship provided a concrete baseline. Its cargo of about 400 amphorae, each weighing around 40 kilograms when full, represented a substantial investment. The almonds alone, which were a luxury item in the ancient world, indicated that merchants traded in specialty goods, not just bulk staples. The ship had probably been on its way from the island of Rhodes to the coast of Syria or Palestine when it sank. That route, spanning over 300 kilometers of open water, was not an accident. It was a planned commercial voyage. The ship gave historians a realistic model for how much a single merchant vessel could carry, how fast it could travel, and what kind of profit it could generate. That changed the way scholars understood the scale and sophistication of ancient maritime commerce. But the ship also left a puzzle. The hull had been repaired multiple times before its final voyage. Patches of lead sheeting covered worn spots in the planking. The mast had been replaced. The ship was old when it sank, perhaps 30 or 40 years in service. That longevity hinted at a deep tradition of shipbuilding and maintenance, a world where vessels were valuable assets that families and trading partnerships invested in over generations. The wreck did not just preserve a single moment. It preserved a long history of use, repair, and adaptation. Every patch told a story of a storm survived, a cargo delivered, a season on the water. As the replica sailed across the same waters, the crew reported something else. They said the ship felt alive. The wooden hull flexed and groaned, but it held together. They could feel the design working. That tactile connection to the past is something that no book or drawing can provide. The ship proved that ancient people were not primitive. They were skilled engineers and pragmatic businessmen, building vessels that could earn their keep over decades of hard use. And it was only one wreck among many. Wrecks from different centuries, different cultures, and different waters continued to surface, each one refining the picture of the past a little more. The next discovery would pull a Roman imperial vessel from the depths, and it would reveal something about the ambitions of emperors and the limits of power. Off the coast of Denmark, a different kind of revelation was waiting. In 1962, excavators working in Fjord uncovered 5 Viking ships that had been deliberately placed there centuries earlier. The vessels were not random wrecks lost to storms or accidents. They had been scuttled on purpose, positioned to block a channel and defend a settlement from sea-borne threats. What seemed at first like a cache of old timbers turned out to be a library of engineering secrets, and it forced historians to completely rethink everything they thought they knew about Viking seafaring. Before this discovery, the popular image of the Viking ship was simple and one-dimensional. Most people pictured a longship with a dragon prow, full of bearded raiders, swift and shallow for surprise attacks. That image was not entirely wrong, but it was incomplete. The ships showed that the Vikings built at least 5 distinct types of vessels, each designed for a specific purpose. There was a cargo ship called a broad-bellied and sturdy, built to carry heavy loads of timber, wool, and trade goods across the open North Atlantic. There were 2 different warships, one smaller and faster for coastal patrols, the other larger and more powerful for fleet actions. There was a fishing vessel and a ferry. The variety was staggering, and it proved that Norse shipwrights were not just raiders. They were sophisticated designers who understood hydrodynamics, load distribution, and material science. The largest of the ships measured about 30 meters long. Based on its construction and the arrangement of its oar holes, researchers concluded it could carry a crew of nearly 60 warriors. Yet it was also capable of sailing under wind power alone, with a massive square sail that gave it impressive speed and range. That combination of oars and sail, along with its shallow draft, allowed Viking fleets to navigate rivers deep inland and then dash across open sea with equal ease. The tactical flexibility was unmatched in northern Europe at the time. The smaller warship, about 18 meters, was built for speed and maneuverability, ideal for scouting or hit-and-run actions. But the cargo ship, was the real revelation. It was about 16 meters long, with a deep, rounded hull that could carry up to 24 tons of freight. That ship was not designed for speed. It was designed for stability on long ocean crossings, and it had the capacity to transport livestock, timber, and bulk goods over distances of more than 1,000 kilometers. Historians had long debated whether the Vikings actually settled Iceland and Greenland in large numbers, or if those were just small seasonal camps. That made it clear that mass migration was not only possible but practical. A single ship could carry several families, their tools, their cattle, and enough supplies to establish a farm. The archaeological evidence backed that up. The Greenland settlements, thriving for centuries, could not have been sustained without regular supply voyages, and there was the vessel that made it happen. To confirm the dates and origins of the ships, researchers turned to Dendrochronology, the same tree ring dating method that had unlocked the age of the wreck. By analyzing the growth patterns in the oak and pine timbers, they could pinpoint exactly when each tree was felled. The results were precise. The ships were built in the 11th century, mostly around the year 1040 or 1050, with some timbers coming from Norway and others from Ireland. That meant the Vikings were not just building ships locally. They were sourcing timber from distant forests, importing high-quality wood to shipyards in Denmark. That kind of resource management required a sophisticated supply chain, a clear understanding of material properties, and a tradition of craftsmanship passed down through generations. The rings also revealed that the oak used for the largest warship came from the Oslo Fjord region in Norway, while the pine for the cargo ship came from western Norway. The shipwrights had selected specific trees for specific parts of the hull, matching species to function. The floors, the curved timbers at the bottom of the hull, were made from naturally grown crooks, branches that grew at an angle and provided extra strength without the need for complex joinery. Every detail showed a deep knowledge of wood and water. The ships also changed how historians understood the Viking world. Before their excavation, many scholars viewed Norse expansion as a series of chaotic raids, hit-and-run attacks by isolated bands of pirates. The ships themselves seemed crude by Mediterranean standards, clinker-built and open-decked, lacking the sophisticated mortise and tenon joinery of Roman galleys. But the fleet proved that the clinker construction, with overlapping planks riveted together, was not primitive. It was an adaptation to northern conditions. The flexible hull could twist and flex with heavy seas without cracking, something a rigid Roman hull could not do. The shallow draft allowed Vikings to beach their ships on any shoreline and drag them over portages between rivers. The square sail, while simple, was remarkably efficient for long-distance downwind sailing. These were not accidental features. They were intentional solutions to the challenges of the North Atlantic, where storms are frequent, harbors are rare, and distances are vast. The Vikings had designed a maritime technology that was perfectly suited to their environment, and that technology gave them a reach that extended from the coasts of North America to the rivers of Russia. Perhaps the most striking insight came from the cargo ship alone. That vessel could carry enough woolen cloth, a major export from Iceland and the Norse settlements, to clothe hundreds of people. It could transport timber from Scandinavia to the treeless islands of the North Atlantic. It could carry grain and iron tools to the far-flung outposts of Greenland. The existence of that ship type proved that the Viking economy was not just about plunder. It was about trade, settlement, and sustained contact across one of the most dangerous stretches of open water in the world. The sagas had always described such voyages, but without material evidence, historians hesitated to accept them as fact. The ships provided that evidence. They showed that the Norse were not just daring, they were meticulous. They built vessels that could survive the battering of the Greenland ice sheet, the gales of the Norwegian Sea, and the long, patient days of an Atlantic crossing. Each ship was a testament to generations of trial and error, and each one carried with it the hopes of families, the dreams of explorers, and the ambitions of chieftains. The excavation at Fjord did not just rewrite Viking naval history. It reframed the entire Viking Age as a period of organized, purposeful expansion, driven by a maritime technology that was centuries ahead of its time. The 5 ships, now housed in the Viking Ship Museum stand as silent witnesses to people who mastered the sea in ways that scholars had never fully appreciated. And they raise an inevitable question. If these 5 ships could change so much, what would the discovery of a complete Viking longship, still buried somewhere in a fjord or a riverbed, reveal about the untold chapters of that seafaring world? The Vasa emerged from the Baltic Sea in 1961, nearly intact. That was the year a salvage team lifted the Swedish warship from the cold, dark water where it had rested since 1628. It had sailed less than 1,300 meters on its maiden voyage, just a few minutes from the docks of Stockholm, before a gust of wind caught its sails and sent it rolling onto its side. The ship sank before the horrified crowd that had gathered to watch it depart. For more than 300 years, it lay in the mud, preserved by the brackish waters that prevented wood-rotting organisms from surviving. When the Vasa finally broke the surface again, historians were not prepared for what they saw. The hull was almost completely intact. Hundreds of wooden carvings, painted lions, mermaids, warriors, and biblical scenes still gleamed with traces of their original colors. The rigging, the blocks, the deadeyes, even some of the sails had survived. It was as if a 17th-century warship had been frozen in time and delivered whole into the modern world. A full-scale model of something that historians had only read about in vague, incomplete records. Because until that moment, everything scholars thought they knew about early modern warships came from 2 sources: written accounts, which were often exaggerated or vague, and small fragments of wrecks that had been torn apart by currents or salvaged for their timbers. Nobody had ever seen an entire ship, fully equipped, exactly as it existed when it was crewed. The Vasa changed that overnight. Its sheer scale was overwhelming. The ship measured about 69 meters from stem to stern, and it carried 64 bronze cannons, far more than any other vessel of its size had been believed to carry. The written records from the 1620s had listed armaments, but they did not convey the staggering density of firepower packed into a wooden hull. Each cannon was mounted on a heavy carriage, each one positioned to blast through a that had been carved into the side. The weight of those guns, combined with the towering sculpture work on the upper decks, had contributed to the ship's fatal instability. King had ordered the Vasa built as the flagship of the Swedish Navy, a floating symbol of power meant to dominate the Baltic. The builders added extra cannons, added higher decks, added more ornamentation, until the ship was top-heavy and unstable. The sinking was not an accident of weather. It was a design failure, driven by ambition and haste. But for historians, that failure became a gift. The Vasa preserved not just a warship, but a snapshot of 17th-century naval ambitions, craftsmanship, and daily life. Archaeologists found the personal belongings of the crew inside the hull: leather shoes, wooden bowls, coins, a backgammon board, a small chest containing a set of carpenter's tools. They found the remains of food: butter, bread, beer, and salted meat. They found tobacco pipes and combs made of bone. Each object told a story about the people who had boarded that ship, expecting to sail to glory, only to vanish within sight of their own city. Even the air inside the Vasa after its raising carried a distinct scent. The wood, soaked in tannins from the Baltic, released a rich aroma of damp oak and pine tar. That smell, captured by conservators, became one of the most evocative links to the past. Visitors to the Vasa Museum in Stockholm describe it as the smell of history itself. It is a sensory echo of the shipyards, the rope walks, and the workshops where the Vasa was born. The preservation went even deeper. Dendrochronology analysis of the oak timbers revealed that the trees used to build the Vasa had been felled in the 1620s, mostly from forests in central Sweden. The rings showed that some of the timber came from trees that were over 200 years old when they were cut. That level of detail allowed historians to reconstruct the supply chain behind a single warship, mapping the forests, the sawmills, the transport routes that fed the Stockholm shipyard. It was a microcosm of the early modern economy, and the sculptures, hundreds of them, were not just decoration. They were political messages. The carved figures depicted the king as a Roman emperor, the Swedish coat of arms as a triumphant lion, and scenes from Greek and Roman mythology that associated Sweden with ancient power. The Vasa was a floating piece of royal propaganda, meant to intimidate rival nations and inspire loyalty in the crew. Without the physical evidence, historians would have underestimated how deeply propaganda was built into the structure of a warship. The Vasa also challenged assumptions about naval power in the early modern period. Before its recovery, many scholars believed that warships of the time were functional and austere, stripped down for combat. The Vasa proved the opposite. Ornamentation was not optional. It was integral to how a ship projected authority, how the crew understood their mission, and how the Navy communicated its strength to the world. The ship was a weapon and a work of art at the same moment. Its sinking was a tragedy, but its rediscovery became a triumph of preservation. The Vasa did not just fill gaps in the historical record, it rewrote entire chapters. It showed that the past is not always buried in fragments. Sometimes it is waiting, whole and breathing, just beneath the surface, ready to challenge every assumption we thought we knew. In 1982, another Tudor warship broke the surface of the English Channel. The Mary Rose, Henry VIII's flagship, had gone down in 1745 during a battle with a French invasion fleet. The king watched from the shore as his pride, his most powerful vessel, rolled onto its side and vanished beneath the waves in less than 2 minutes. Nearly all of the crew, about 500 men, were trapped below decks and drowned. For over 4 centuries, the ship lay buried in the soft mud of the Solent, a narrow strait between the English mainland and the Isle of Wight. That mud was the key to its preservation. Cold, dark, and free of the wood boring worms that devour most wrecks in warmer waters, the silt had sealed the hull and everything inside it in a near-perfect state. When the Mary Rose was finally raised in 1982, after years of painstaking excavation and engineering, the world saw something no living person had ever witnessed: a Tudor warship, fully furnished, exactly as it existed on the day it sank. The hull itself was only partially intact. The upper decks had collapsed, but the lower portion, the hold and the orlop deck, where the crew lived and worked, held a staggering treasure. Over 26,000 artifacts emerged from the mud, and they were not the kind of artifacts that historians expected. Until that moment, most scholarly accounts of Tudor naval life were based on official records, ship inventories, and a handful of drawings. Those sources suggested that warships were Spartan, cramped, and purely functional. The crew slept on bare planks, ate simple rations, and owned little beyond their wages and their weapons. The Mary Rose shattered that image completely. Archaeologists found carved wooden tankards, leather shoes, silk ribbons, velvet caps, and even a backgammon board with its pieces still inside a storage chest. They found combs made of bone and ivory, tweezers, ear scoops, and a small folding razor. These were not the possessions of a rough, illiterate crew. They were the personal belongings of men who took pride in their appearance, who spent their leisure time in quiet games, and who carried small luxuries from home. The weapons, too, told a more complex story. The Mary Rose was armed with heavy bronze cannons, longbows, and a massive quantity of iron shot. But among the military gear, the excavators found a surprising number of objects that seemed out of place on a warship. There was a set of copper alloy surgeon's instruments, including a saw for amputations and a probe for cleaning wounds. There were pewter plates and spoons, some still stacked together as if the crew had just finished a meal. There were barrels of preserved fish, joints of salted beef, and even a cask of butter. The official records had mentioned rations, but they had never captured the sheer volume and variety of food that a warship carried. The Mary Rose was not just a fighting platform. It was a floating community, a small town of about 500 men, with its own cooks, surgeons, carpenters, gunners, and officers. Perhaps the most profound revelations came from the human remains. Over 90 skeletons were found within the wreck, preserved by the same oxygen-free mud that saved the ship. Forensic analysis of those bones gave historians their first direct glimpse of the bodies behind the history books. The men of the Mary Rose were generally young, most between 18 and 30 years old. But their skeletons told a story of hard living. Many showed healed fractures, signs of healed rib breaks, broken noses, and damaged hands that suggested years of heavy labor. Their teeth were worn down by the grit in their bread, and many had abscesses that must have caused constant pain. The bones revealed that the crew suffered from a bone disease called osteophytes, bony growths on the spine caused by years of carrying heavy loads and hauling ropes. The diet, analyzed through chemical traces in the bones, showed a high intake of marine protein, fish and shellfish, mixed with grain. Some of the crew had eaten a surprisingly varied diet, including meat and dairy, which suggested that the officers ate better than the common sailors. And then there were the signs of more serious health challenges. Several skeletons showed evidence of syphilis, a disease that had spread across Europe in the decades before the Mary Rose sank. The presence of that infection among the crew provided a rare window into the health landscape of the 16th century, a time when such diseases were poorly understood and often fatal. The Mary Rose changed the way historians think about Tudor seafaring not through a single dramatic artifact, but through the accumulation of thousands of small, ordinary details. Every shoe, every comb, every fragment of cloth told a story that the official records had left out. The ship was a snapshot of a moment, a frozen instant of life that had been lost to history for over 4 centuries, until the mud gave it back. And it proved that a shipwreck is not just a disaster. It is a time capsule that captures the ordinary moments of life, the ones that history books often forget, and holds them safe until someone comes to listen. The Batavia tells a very different story from the Mary Rose, one that forced historians to confront the darkest edges of maritime ambition. In 1972, divers exploring the waters off Western Australia stumbled upon the remains of a Dutch East India Company ship that had been lost for over 300 years. The Batavia had set sail from the Netherlands in 1628, bound for the Spice Islands of the East Indies, loaded with silver coins, cargo, and passengers. It was a flagship of one of the most powerful trading corporations in history, a vessel designed to project wealth and authority across the oceans. But it never reached its destination. The ship struck a reef near a cluster of small islands off the Australian coast, a place now called the Islands. Most of the crew and passengers managed to reach a nearby island, stranded and desperate. The captain and a small group of officers sailed away in a longboat to seek help, leaving behind about 250 people on a barren, waterless strip of sand. What happened next was not a story of survival. It was a story of order collapsing into chaos, of authority breaking down, and of a small number of individuals taking control through fear and force. When archaeologists began excavating the wreck site in the 1970s, they found the expected cargo: silver coins, bronze cannons, stone architectural pieces, and the remains of the hull. But what they found on the nearby islands was far more disturbing. The remains of the passengers, men, women, and children, had been discovered decades earlier by local fishermen. The bones told a violent story. But the archaeological work on the Batavia transformed that discovery from a local mystery into a global historical revelation. The excavators uncovered the remnants of the mutineers' camp. They found tools, weapons, and personal belongings that had been left behind. They mapped the locations of the burials and the massacre site. And as they pieced together the sequence of events, the old image of the Dutch East India Company as a disciplined, orderly commercial empire began to crack. The official records of the company described a world of strict hierarchy, clear rules, and efficient operations. The Batavia proved that the reality was far more unstable. The leader of the mutineers, a man named, had exploited the chaos after the shipwreck to seize control. He used fear and manipulation to turn a group of survivors into perpetrators. Over the course of several weeks, his followers killed more than 120 people, men, women, and children, in a calculated attempt to eliminate anyone who might resist or report them. When the captain finally returned with a rescue ship, the mutineers were captured and executed after a brief trial. But the archaeological work did not stop at uncovering the massacre. It went deeper, into the physical remains of the ship itself. The Batavia carried a remarkable cargo that had nothing to do with trade. It carried a stone portico, an entire arched gateway made of carved limestone, intended to be used as an entrance for a fort or a warehouse in the Dutch East Indies. That portico, decorated with ornate carvings of lions, coats of arms, and classical figures, was a symbol of the company's ambitions. It was intended to announce the power of the Dutch East India Company in the most permanent way possible, through architecture carved in stone. When the ship sank, that portico sank with it. Divers recovered the pieces over several decades, and conservators painstakingly reconstructed the entire structure. Standing today in a museum in Western Australia, the Batavia portico is a haunting monument. It represents the grand ambitions of a corporation that saw itself as the ruler of oceans, and the shattered dreams of the people who boarded that ship expecting a new life. But the Batavia discovery changed more than the story of one ship. It changed the way historians understood the Dutch East India Company itself. For centuries, the company had been portrayed as a model of efficiency and discipline. Its records were meticulous, its voyages were documented, and its success was undeniable. But the Batavia showed that beneath that polished surface lay a world of extreme violence, where authority could break down in an instant, where ambition could curdle into cruelty, and where the distance from civilization turned ordinary people into something unrecognizable. The archaeological work on the Batavia did something that no written record could achieve. It combined the methods of nautical archaeology with the precision of a forensic crime scene investigation. Every bone fragment, every tool, every bullet casing was mapped and analyzed. The positions of the remains told a story of how the victims died, in what order, and in what locations. The analysis of the wounds showed the types of weapons used and the force required. It was not just history, it was evidence, gathered with the same rigor that a modern detective would apply to a crime scene. That approach gave the victims a voice that the official archives had silenced. Their bones spoke of desperation, of betrayal, and of a struggle for survival that had been erased from the official record. The Batavia transformed the study of shipwrecks from a search for treasure into a search for truth. It proved that the ocean floor holds not just artifacts, but entire narratives, stories of power and weakness, of order and collapse, that challenge everything we thought we knew about the people who came before us. And it left a lingering question. If one ship, discovered by accident, could reveal such a hidden chapter, What other dark corners of history are still waiting beneath the waves, preserved in silence, until someone finds them in March of 2022, a team of ice-hardened explorers finally found what had lost. The Endurance, the ship that carried 28 men into the heart of the Antarctic, had been crushed by pack ice in 1915 and had sunk into the sea. For over a century, its exact location remained a mystery, a legend of endurance and survival that ended with the crew rowing lifeboats to Elephant Island and then crossing 800 miles of open ocean to South Georgia. But the ship itself, the wooden vessel that had been slowly squeezed by the ice until its timbers groaned and gave way, had vanished beneath the frozen surface. When the search team located it, they were not prepared for what the cameras showed. The Endurance rested upright on the 3,000 meters down, in water so cold and so dark that time had all but stopped. Its hull was intact. The masts were still standing, though broken at the tops. The rigging lay draped across the deck like frozen spider silk. Even the name, Endurance, curved across the stern in brass letters, was still clearly visible. The wood had not been consumed by the wood-boring organisms that devour most wrecks in warmer oceans. The lack of such creatures, combined with the near-freezing temperatures and the absence of strong currents, had preserved the ship almost exactly as it had been on the day it slipped beneath the ice. That level of preservation changed something fundamental in the way historians understood the Endurance story. For decades, the only visual record came from Frank Hurley, the expedition photographer who had captured haunting images of the ship trapped in the ice, listing under pressure, before it finally sank. His photographs were celebrated as works of art and documents of desperation, but they were only a partial record. They showed the ship from a limited number of angles, and they could not reveal what happened below the waterline during the crushing. The discovery of the wreck confirmed that Hurley had captured the moment of crisis with amazing accuracy. The damage to the hull matched the angles and positions visible in his photographs. The way the ice had compressed the planking, the location of the fractures, the final resting posture, all of it aligned with the visual story he had frozen in glass plates. But the wreck also showed something that Hurley could not have seen. It revealed that the ship had not broken apart in a sudden catastrophic collapse, as some historians had guessed. Instead, the pressure had caused the timbers to flex and buckle gradually over days and weeks until the hull finally yielded. The evidence lay in the subtle bends and splits in the wood, patterns that could only be studied with the ship fully exposed. That detail reshaped how researchers understood the structural behavior of wooden ships under extreme ice loads. It provided data that could inform modern engineering in polar environments, and it deepened the respect for the craftsmanship of the builders, who had constructed a vessel strong enough to survive for months in the grip of the Antarctic ice before finally succumbing. The Endurance became more than a shipwreck. It became a symbol of human endurance, not just of and his crew, but of the ship itself, which had carried its men through the worst the planet could throw at them and then waited below the waves for over a century, patiently holding its story. For the descendants of the expedition members, the discovery brought a sense of closure. For historians, it provided a rare chance to study a deep-water wreck that had been untouched by salvage, by currents, or by biological decay. Every timber, every rope, every brass fitting was exactly as it had been left. The sea had acted as a giant freezer, preserving not just the ship but the moment of its loss. The Endurance stood as a museum of a single, terrible, and triumphant event. But not all deep-water discoveries carry that same story of slow endurance and eventual rescue. Some are about sudden tragedy, ships that went down in moments, taking their crews with them, leaving only fragments scattered across the next wreck in this journey would reveal a very different kind of ending, one that came without warning, without time to prepare, and without any chance of survival. In 1985, a team located the Titanic nearly 4 kilometers down. That discovery did not just solve a 73-year-old mystery. It launched an entirely new field of exploration, deep-sea archaeology, and it forced historians to rewrite the final moments of the most famous disaster in maritime history. Until that moment, the Titanic existed only in survivor accounts, newspaper headlines, and a handful of grainy photographs of the ship as it departed Southampton. No one knew exactly what lay beneath the North Atlantic, whether the hull had broken apart on the surface or sank in one piece, whether the stern had settled upright on the seabed or had been twisted beyond recognition. The answers came in a series of haunting video images, captured by a remotely operated vehicle named Argo, which glided over in the darkness. The first thing the team saw was a massive boiler, still resting on the bottom, and then, emerging from the gloom, the great bow of the ship. It was astonishingly intact, rising from the mud as if it had just come to rest there. The railing still stood. The portholes were still in place. The name, White Star Line, was clearly visible on the hull, but as the camera panned across the debris field, a different picture formed. Hundreds of meters away lay the stern section, a crumpled, twisted mass of metal, torn open and flattened by the force of the impact with the ocean floor. The two pieces were separated by a long trail of debris, coal, pieces of furniture, personal belongings scattered across the seabed. That arrangement told a clear story. The ship had broken apart at the surface, not while sinking as some earlier theories had suggested. The bow, full of water and heavy, had descended in a relatively straight line, digging into the mud. The stern, lighter and filled with air pockets, had plunged violently, spinning and tumbling before slamming into the bottom. The images also disproved the long-held belief that the stern had settled upright. In reality, it was almost unrecognizable as a ship. The discovery changed the historical narrative in a fundamental way. For decades, the official inquiries had assumed the ship sank intact, based on survivor accounts that described a sudden lurch and then silence. The wreck proved otherwise. It also revealed the precise sequence of breakup. The hull had fractured at the surface, between the third and fourth funnels, and the bow had likely sunk quickly, while the stern remained afloat for several minutes before its own catastrophic descent. That revised timeline altered the understanding of how much time passengers had, where the strongest part of the ship was, and why some lifeboats had not been fully launched. But the discovery also opened a heated and lasting debate. Almost immediately, plans for salvage operations emerged. Some argued that the Titanic was a historic artifact, a museum of Edwardian craftsmanship, and that its contents should be recovered for public display and research. Others saw it as something far more sacred. Over 1,500 people had died that night. Their final resting place was not a graveyard on land, but a stretch of cold ocean floor, scattered across the debris field and within the hull itself. To many, the wreck was a memorial, not a salvage site. The controversy intensified when commercial expeditions began recovering objects, china, jewelry, coins, even a piece of the hull itself, and selling them or displaying them in museums. Critics argued that this was grave robbing, that the wreck was a tomb that should be left undisturbed. Proponents countered that the artifacts held historical value and would decay if left, and that the recovery of objects allowed the public to connect with the story in a tangible way. The debate continues to this day, with no easy resolution. What cannot be disputed is the impact of the Titanic discovery on an entire generation of explorers, scientists, and historians. Before 1985, deep-sea exploration was a niche pursuit, limited by primitive technology and a lack of funding. The Titanic proved that a wreck could be located, filmed, and studied at depths of nearly 4,000 meters. It demonstrated that the deep ocean was not an inaccessible void, but a realm that could be systematically explored, mapped, and understood. In the years that followed, teams used the same techniques to find other legendary wrecks, including the Bismarck, the Lusitania, and the Endurance. The Titanic became the catalyst that turned deep-sea archaeology from a dream into a real, funded, and respected discipline. It showed that below the reach of sunlight, beyond the pressure limits of human divers, whole chapters of history lay preserved, waiting for the right technology and the right questions to bring them back to light. and it raised a question that still echoes through every deep-sea expedition. If one of the most famous wrecks in history could be found and studied with such precision, what other secrets does the abyss still hold in 1975? Explorers found the Britannic resting on its side in the clear waters of the Aegean. The ship was the Titanic's sister vessel, built by the same White Star Line and launched just a few years after the disaster that had claimed over 1,500 lives. Unlike the Titanic, the Britannic had been converted into a hospital ship during the First World War, and it sank in 1916 after striking a mine or being hit by a torpedo, depending on which account you read. For decades, the official story held that a single underwater explosion had torn open the hull, causing the ship to go down in 55 minutes. That timeline seemed plausible, given the ship's supposed improvements over the Titanic. But the wreck told a very different tale. When divers finally reached the hull, they found something unexpected. The ship lay on its starboard side, and almost all of its large portholes on the lower decks were wide open. That detail changed everything. The water had not entered through a single gaping wound. It had poured in through dozens of small openings, flooding multiple compartments at once. The crew had opened those portholes to air out the sick wards and operating theaters, and in the chaos of the evacuation, nobody had thought to close them. So the ship sank far faster than anyone had predicted. That discovery forced historians to re-examine the official logs and survivor testimonies. Some accounts had mentioned an explosion, but the wreck showed no evidence of a massive rupture. Instead, the damage was consistent with a much smaller event, perhaps a mine that breached the hull near the bow, and then the open portholes did the rest. The Britannic had been built with far more watertight compartments and better lifeboat capacity than its doomed sister. In that sense, it was a safer ship. But the lesson was more about human behavior than design. Even the best engineering could be undone by a simple oversight, like leaving windows open on a summer morning. The wreck also revealed something about the ship's final moments. The bow had settled quickly, but the rest of the vessel had stayed afloat long enough for many of the crew and medical staff to escape. Over 1,000 people survived, thanks in part to the lifeboats, but 30 people lost their lives, mostly because 2 lifeboats were launched too early and were sucked into the still-turning propellers. The position of the wreck, the tilt of the hull, and the debris field confirmed that the propellers had been running until the very end, a detail that earlier reports had not captured. All of this added up to a much clearer picture of early 20th century ship construction and emergency protocols. Naval architects learned that portholes needed to be designed so they could be sealed quickly from a central location, and that crew training had to include drills for closing every potential opening. The Britannic became a case study in the difference between theoretical safety and real-world operations. It showed that the Titanic disaster had led to genuine reforms, but that those reforms could only go so far if the people on board were not prepared. The stark hull, still gleaming white in the underwater light, remains a monument to that lesson. And while sisters of the great liners often steal the spotlight, the next discovery proved that cargo ships, the workhorses of the sea, held stories just as powerful and secrets that could overturn entire chapters of economic history. A different kind of treasure lay hidden 2,200 meters beneath the Atlantic, and it took over a century to find. The SS Central America was a steamer that set sail from Panama in September of 1857. It carried nearly 600 passengers and crew, along with a cargo that would become the stuff of legend, over 15 tons of gold. That gold had come from the California Gold Rush, shipped east in the form of coins, bars, and nuggets, meant to feed the booming economy of the United States. But the ship never reached its destination. A hurricane caught it off the coast of the Carolinas, battering the vessel for 2 full days. On September 12th, the Central America slipped beneath the waves, taking 425 people and all that gold with it. For decades, the wreck was a ghost story, a tale told by maritime historians but never confirmed. Then in 1988, a team led by the ocean engineer Tommy located it, sitting upright on the, preserved by the cold, dark waters of the deep Atlantic. The recovery operation that followed was unlike anything attempted before. Had spent years developing specialized equipment, including a remotely operated vehicle named, capable of descending to depths that had only recently become accessible. At that depth is under immense pressure, and the darkness is absolute. But the cameras revealed something astonishing. The wooden hull, built from white oak and yellow pine, was still intact. The ship's massive engine, a walking beam steam engine that had once driven the paddle wheels, stood upright, its iron parts coated in a thin crust of rust but otherwise recognizable. Even the ship's bell, engraved with the name Central America, was found lying on the deck. The gold, however, was not just a rumor. It was there, scattered across the debris field and packed inside the hull, thousands of coins and ingots gleaming faintly in the lights of the submersible. The recovery team brought up over $1 billion worth of gold, adjusted for modern value. That haul was not just a treasure hunter's dream, it was a historian's. The coins, minted in San Francisco and other California mints, provided an unprecedented snapshot of the American economy on the eve of the 1857 panic. That panic, one of the first global financial crises, had been triggered partly by the loss of the Central America. The gold on board was destined for banks in New York and the East Coast, and when it vanished, it helped destabilize an already fragile banking system. The recovery allowed economists to estimate the exact size of that lost shipment, confirming that it was indeed a significant portion of the total gold supply in circulation at the time. The discovery reshaped the understanding of how a single shipwreck could ripple through an entire economy, turning a maritime disaster into a financial crisis. But the legal battle that followed was perhaps even more significant for history. When and his team recovered the gold, a swarm of lawsuits erupted. Insurance companies claimed they had paid out claims in the 1850s and therefore owned the gold. The descendants of the passengers argued that the treasure belonged to the families of those who had lost everything. The state of Florida and the federal government both asserted jurisdiction over the waters. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the ruling that emerged redefined the law of salvage for deep water wrecks. The court established that a finder who invests substantial resources and uses careful archaeological methods can claim ownership of recovered artifacts, even in international waters, as long as they respect the site and do not disturb human remains. That decision set a precedent that governed every major deep-sea salvage operation that followed, from the Titanic to the Endurance. The Central America became not just a treasure ship, but a legal landmark, proving that the deep ocean could be both a historical archive and a commercial frontier. The preservation of the ship itself added another layer to the story. At 2,200 meters, the water is near freezing and almost completely devoid of oxygen. Wood-boring organisms cannot survive there, so the hull remained largely intact for over a century. The engine, a masterpiece of mid-19th century engineering, was still recognizable as the heart of the ship. The wooden spokes of the paddle wheels, the iron braces, the brass fittings, all of it was there, frozen in time. That level of preservation meant that historians could study the construction techniques of an 1850s steamer in detail that was previously impossible. They could see how the planks were fastened, how the copper sheathing was attached to protect against corrosion, and how the steam engine was mounted to absorb the stresses of heavy seas. The Central America became a textbook of 19th century shipbuilding, delivered intact from a vanished era. The discovery also proved something more fundamental. Before 1988, many believed that deep water wrecks were essentially unreachable, or that any artifacts recovered would be too degraded to be valuable. The Central America shattered that assumption. It showed that with the right technology and enough patience, the deep ocean could yield treasures that were not just glittering but historically transformative. It opened the door for expeditions that would later find Roman shipwrecks in the Mediterranean, Viking vessels in the Baltic, and even the wrecks of ancient Greek merchant ships. The Golden Steamer was a turning point, a moment when the depths of the sea stopped being a limit and became a horizon. And as the gold coins were counted and catalogued, one question lingered in the minds of every explorer watching. If a ship from the 1850s could survive so perfectly, what other corners of the past were still waiting, sealed in the dark, cold silence, for someone to bring them back to light in the clear blue waters of the Red Sea? A ghost from the Second World War rests on the sandy bottom. The SS was a British merchant ship, built to carry supplies across dangerous oceans. On October 6, 1941, it lay at anchor near the Egyptian coast, waiting for dawn to enter the Suez Canal. German bombers found it first. 2 bombs struck the ship, igniting its cargo of ammunition and sending it to the bottom in minutes. For 15 years, the wreck sat undisturbed, known only to local fishermen and a few British naval records. Then in 1956, a French explorer named located it using his research ship Calypso. He brought back film and photographs, but the world paid little attention at first. It was only decades later, as recreational diving grew into a global pastime, that they revealed its true value. Divers who descended into the wreck found something extraordinary. The hold contained a perfectly preserved inventory of the war effort. There were Bedford trucks, still lined up in rows, their tires intact, and their steering wheels waiting for a driver. There were motorcycles, packed in wooden crates, their handlebars polished and ready. There were boxes of bullets, stacks of shells, and even 2 railway locomotives, destined for the supply lines of North Africa. The cargo was not just a jumble. It was a snapshot of logistics, frozen at the moment of loss. Historians had known that the Allies shipped vast quantities of equipment to the Middle East through the Red Sea, but the written records could only list what left the factories. They could not show how the equipment was packed, how it was arranged in the hold, or how it was distributed once it arrived. They provided that missing piece. It proved that the trucks were shipped fully assembled, not knocked down for quick reassembly, a detail that changed how researchers understood the speed of Allied supply chains. It showed that motorcycles and vehicles were mixed with ammunition, meaning ships had to be loaded with extreme care to prevent a chain reaction of explosions. And the presence of 2 locomotives, each weighing over 30 tons, demonstrated the immense scale of the operation. The British military had to move entire rail systems into the desert, and there was a key part of that pipeline. The wreck also preserved the human dimension of those shipments. Divers found personal items scattered among the cargo: a pair of boots, a mess tin, a small religious medal. These objects reminded everyone that the war effort was not just about machines. It was about people, sailors and soldiers who lived and worked on these vessels, often unaware of the dangers they carried. They sank quickly, and most of the crew escaped, but 9 men lost their lives that night. Their loss is part of the story, but the site remains a place of learning and respect. Today, the is one of the most famous dive sites on the planet. Thousands of divers visit each year, descending into the wreck to swim through its holds and corridors. The experience is not just an adventure. It is a direct encounter with history, a chance to see a world war as it actually existed, not through a textbook, but through the rusting metal and scattered equipment of a ship that still holds its cargo. That transformation, from a wartime tragedy to a living museum, changed the way people connected with the past. It proved that history does not have to stay on land. Sometimes, it waits below the surface, preserved in cold, ready to teach anyone willing to dive down and look. For centuries, pirates existed only in legend and Hollywood imagination. The Whydah changed that in 1984, when treasure hunters off Cape Cod finally located the wreck of Samuel's flagship, lost in a furious storm in 1717. For decades, everything historians thought they knew about pirates came from a handful of written accounts, some exaggerated, some invented, and from romantic paintings of swashbuckling rogues with eye patches and parrots. The Whydah delivered something far more reliable: physical evidence, thousands of objects pulled from the sand, each one a direct witness to the real world of Atlantic piracy. The first clue was the ship's bell, recovered early in the excavation. It was engraved with the name Whydah and the year 1716. That single artifact confirmed the wreck's identity beyond any doubt, but the discoveries that followed were far more revealing. Among the scattered remains, archaeologists found the personal belongings of the crew: pewter plates, clay pipes, buttons, buckles, and fragments of clothing. They found weapons, cutlasses, pistols, and musket balls, but also tools for mending sails and repairing rigging. The ship was not just a floating weapon. It was a working vessel, a home for men who spent months at sea. Perhaps the most striking evidence came from the human remains themselves. Over the years, excavations recovered bones from dozens of individuals. Forensic analysis showed that the crew of the Whydah was remarkably diverse. They were not the band of white European outcasts that popular culture had imagined. They were a multi-ethnic group, including men of African descent, Native Americans, and sailors from across the European colonies. The analysis of their teeth, bones, and burial positions revealed that many had lived hard lives before joining, with signs of healed injuries and long-term physical stress. That diversity changed the way historians understood pirate crews. The Whydah proved that piracy in the early 18th century was not a closed, homogeneous world. It was a space where men from different backgrounds could find a place, often because they had been excluded from the rigid hierarchies of colonial society. The crew operated under a democratic system. They elected their officers, shared the plunder according to a written agreement, and compensated members who were injured in battle. That structure was not a myth. The artifacts confirmed it: the distribution of goods, the quality of personal possessions, and the absence of the stark class divisions that defined life on naval ships. The Whydah also revealed the global nature of pirate trade. The cargo included thousands of coins from every corner of the Atlantic world: Spanish silver pieces of 8, French gold Louis R, English guineas, and even coins from the Middle East and Asia. Had captured a slave ship, the Whydah itself, before converting it into his flagship. That ship had originally been designed to transport enslaved people from Africa to the Caribbean. When took it, the hold was filled with gold, silver, and goods that represented the entire web of colonial commerce. The coins proved that pirates did not just rob ships. They tapped into the arteries of a global economy, drawing wealth from Africa, the Americas, and Europe all at once. For historians, the Whydah was a turning point. Before its discovery, pirate studies relied almost entirely on trial records, broadside ballads, and sensational accounts written by captured pirates to gain public sympathy. Those sources were unreliable. They blended fact with fiction, and they often exaggerated or distorted the truth. The Whydah provided a baseline of physical reality. Every artifact, every coin, every fragment of bone became a piece of evidence that could be tested, measured, and compared. The excavation did not just rewrite pirate lore. It turned piracy from a romantic legend into a serious field of historical inquiry. The wreck proved that pirate ships were not chaotic mobs of criminals. They were structured communities with their own rules, their own cultures, and their own connections to the wider world. The Whydah also left a lingering question. If one ship, discovered by chance, could overturn so many myths, what other pirate wrecks still lie hidden, waiting to reveal the real stories behind the legend? 7 years later, off the coast of North Carolina, another pirate wreck surfaced. In 1996, a research team working in Inlet identified a cluster of cannons and anchors as the remains of the Queen Anne's Revenge, the flagship of the most notorious pirate in Atlantic history, a man known as Blackbeard. The ship had run aground and been abandoned in 1718, just months before Blackbeard himself met his end in a fierce battle with British naval forces. For nearly 3 centuries, the wreck sat buried under sand and shifting currents, largely forgotten except in legends. When the team finally confirmed the identity, the discovery did more than add a name to a list of wrecks. It pulled Blackbeard out of myth and placed him squarely in the realm of verifiable history. The excavation that followed uncovered a wealth of artifacts that changed the way historians understood early 18th century piracy. The cannons, 25 of them, were a mix of different sizes and origins. Some were English, some French, some Spanish, captured from vessels across the Atlantic. That variety proved that Blackbeard was not a lone wolf raiding with a single ship. He commanded a small fleet, and he had the firepower to challenge even naval warships. The anchors told a similar story. They were heavy, well-made, and many showed signs of repair, suggesting a captain who kept his vessels in constant readiness. But the most surprising finds were not weapons. They were medical instruments. Excavators recovered a brass syringe, a mortar and pestle, and fragments of glass vials. These were tools used for treating wounds and illness, not for attacking. Their presence showed that a pirate ship was not just a floating gun platform. It was a self-contained community that needed to care for its own. Sick and injured crew members could not simply go to a hospital. They had to be treated on board, often by a surgeon who was himself a former captive or a willing recruit. The artifacts proved that pirate ships operated with a level of organization that historians had previously underestimated. The ship timbers themselves added another layer of evidence. Portions of the hull had survived, buried beneath the sand, and Dendrochronology revealed the age and origins of the wood. The planks came from trees felled in the early 1700s, consistent with the vessel's known history as a French slave ship captured by Blackbeard in 1717. But more importantly, the timbers showed signs of modification. Holes had been bored and repaired, planks had been replaced, the ship had been altered to carry more cannons and to accommodate a larger crew. Those modifications confirmed that Blackbeard was not content to sail a stock vessel. He customized his flagship to suit his style of piracy, adding extra firepower and strengthening the hull for the punishing conditions of the Atlantic. That kind of hands-on adaptation reflected a captain who understood seamanship, logistics, and the psychology of intimidation. The Queen Anne's Revenge was not just a stolen ship. It was a statement, a floating fortress designed to strike fear into the hearts of merchant captains. The discovery also forced a reassessment of Blackbeard himself. For decades, popular culture had painted him as a minor figure, a flashy pirate whose reputation was mostly bluff. The physical evidence told a different story. The sheer number of cannons, the quality of the anchors, the medical equipment, and the modified hull all pointed to a pirate who was wealthy, well-organized, and deeply embedded in the networks of Atlantic trade. He was not a sideshow. He was a major player in a world where piracy was a serious business, conducted with discipline and purpose. Together with the Whydah, the Queen Anne's Revenge transformed pirate studies. The two wrecks provided a body of concrete evidence that allowed archaeologists to test old assumptions and build new models. The Whydah had revealed the diversity and democracy of pirate crews. The Queen Anne's Revenge showed the operational side, how a pirate flagship was built, armed, and maintained. They proved that pirate archaeology was not a niche curiosity. It was a legitimate field, capable of delivering insights that written records alone could never provide. And as the artifacts were cataloged and studied, one question hung in the salt air. If two such wrecks could overturn centuries of myth and legend, how many others still lay buried, waiting to reveal the true face of piracy a century after Blackbeard's flagship slipped beneath the waves? Another vessel sank off the coast of Colombia, carrying a cargo so vast that even the most seasoned treasure hunters called it the Holy Grail. The Spanish galleon San was on its way to Cartagena in 1708 when a British squadron caught it in the waters near them. A fierce exchange of cannon fire ended with a catastrophic explosion that tore the ship apart and sent it to the depths, along with nearly 600 people. For over 300 years, the wreck lay hidden, its exact location a mystery that sparked endless rumors and fruitless searches. Then in 2015, the Colombian government announced that a joint expedition with a team of international researchers had finally found it, resting on the seabed at a depth of about 600 meters. The announcement sent shockwaves far beyond maritime archaeology. The San was not just any wreck. It carried one of the largest treasure cargoes ever recorded from the Spanish colonial era: gold coins, silver bars, and emeralds, so abundant that early estimates placed the value in the billions of dollars. Some reports suggested the treasure could be worth over $17 billion at modern market prices. That staggering figure forced historians to the scale of the Spanish wealth shipments that flowed from the Americas to Europe during the 17th and early 18th centuries. For decades, scholars had relied on port records, tax documents, and ship manifests to calculate how much gold and silver crossed the Atlantic. The San offered a concrete, physical snapshot of a single voyage that carried more value than many entire fleets. The sheer density of precious metals on board challenged the old assumption that even the richest galleons carried only modest fortunes. The San proved that the Spanish crown was moving truly colossal sums through the Caribbean, sums that could fund wars, reshape economies, and alter the balance of power in Europe. But the discovery ignited a legal and cultural firestorm that had little to do with the treasure itself. The wreck lies in Colombian waters, giving the Colombian government clear jurisdiction under international maritime law. Spain, however, claimed ownership, arguing that the ship and its cargo were property of the Spanish state, lost but never abandoned. A group of descendants of the crew also stepped forward, asserting that the remains of their ancestors and the objects on board were part of their cultural heritage. And a private salvage company, which had originally located the wreck years earlier but kept it secret, demanded a share of the recovered treasure under a contract signed before the discovery. The case wound through courts in Colombia, the United States, and international arbitration bodies. At its heart was a fundamental question that no previous shipwreck had forced so clearly into the open: who owns the past? Is a sunken ship a treasure trove to be divided among finders and governments, or is it an archaeological site that belongs to humanity, to be studied and preserved for future generations? The San became the symbol of that tension. The Colombian government, under pressure from both national pride and international law, initially kept the exact location secret to protect the site from unauthorized salvage. Meanwhile, archaeologists argued that any recovery operation should prioritize scientific documentation over commercial gain. The ship itself, constructed from oak and pine and preserved by the cold, low-oxygen water of the Caribbean, could hold invaluable information about Spanish shipbuilding, trade networks, and daily life in the early 18th century. The cannons, the navigational instruments, the personal belongings of the crew, all of it represented a chapter of history that had been lost for 3 centuries. But the billion-dollar question of who gets the gold dominated headlines, overshadowing the quieter debate about how to treat the site. The legal battles dragged on for years, and as of the early 2020s, the San remained largely undisturbed, a ghost ship still laden with its cargo, waiting for a decision that would determine whether it became a museum, a salvage operation, or a perpetual source of controversy. More than any other discovery, the San forced historians and the public to confront a difficult truth: the is not a neutral archive. It is a contested space where national pride, corporate interests, cultural heritage, and the rights of descendant communities collide. The ship itself, resting in darkness, has become a mirror reflecting the values and conflicts of the modern world, and the question it raises will echo long after the last coin is brought to the surface. Who really owns the stories buried beneath the waves, the search for the consumed more than 15 years and claimed several lives? Fisher, a former chicken farmer turned treasure hunter, had gambled everything on a single hunch. He believed that a Spanish galleon lost in a hurricane off the Florida Keys in 1622 still held its cargo somewhere on the ocean floor. For over a decade, his team dragged magnetometers across hundreds of square miles of seabed, finding nothing but scraps and false leads. Banks refused to lend money. Creditors circled. Fisher sold shares in the expedition to keep it afloat. And then, on July 20th, 1985, his son radioed back a single word: "Put the coffee on, we found it." What they had found was not just a shipwreck. It was a time capsule from the height of Spanish imperial power, and it would force historians to rethink the entire scale of the colonial treasure system. The had been part of a fleet carrying silver from the mines of in present-day Bolivia, gold from Colombia, and emeralds from Colombia and Peru. The ship's manifest, preserved in the Spanish archives, listed the cargo at about 900,000 pesos in silver and gold. But the recovered treasure far exceeded that figure. Fisher's team brought up over 40 tons of silver, including coins and bars, along with more than 100,000 gold coins, hundreds of emeralds, and a chest of uncut gems. The total value in modern terms reached into the hundreds of millions of dollars. That discrepancy between the archived manifest and the physical recovery proved something that scholars had long suspected but could never confirm. The Spanish crown routinely underreported the value of its treasure shipments to avoid taxes and to conceal the true wealth flowing from the colonies. This showed that the official records were not just incomplete, they were deliberately misleading. The economic history of the early colonial period had to be rewritten, because the actual volume of precious metals moving across the Atlantic was far larger than any document had suggested. But the discovery also revealed a more human story. Among the thousands of artifacts, the team found personal belongings of the passengers and crew: a gold crucifix, a silver chalice, a set of navigational instruments, and the remains of a small dog. These objects connected the treasure to the people who had sailed on that ship, people who had lost everything in a storm that sank 8 vessels and killed over 500 individuals. The excavation was not just a salvage operation. It was an archaeological project. Fisher's team mapped the debris field, documented the position of each artifact, and preserved fragile items like cloth and wood that would have disintegrated if pulled up carelessly. They worked alongside marine archaeologists, sharing methods and data, even though the line between treasure hunter and scientist usually ran straight through a courtroom. It became a rare case where both sides found common ground. The treasure paid for the search, but the careful recovery ensured that the historical value was not lost. That balance, between the lure of gold and the need for knowledge, defined the legacy. And it set the stage for a very different kind of discovery, one where the treasure was not silver or gold, but something far more fragile and far more revealing. A discovery that would prove, once and for all, that the most valuable cargo on the ocean floor is not what glitters but what teaches. In 1998, fishermen pulling their nets off the coast of Indonesia found something far stranger than fish. Their anchors snagged on a mound of clay pots, and when they hauled them up, they saw bowls and plates covered in green glaze, decorated with flowers and birds. They had stumbled onto a shipwreck, but not just any wreck. This was a 9th-century Arab dhow, a vessel built from planks sewn together with coconut fiber, a technique that historians had only read about in old travel accounts. And its cargo was a revelation. The ship carried over 60,000 ceramic pieces, mostly from the kilns of Changsha in southern China, made during the Tang dynasty. That single discovery changed the timeline of global trade by centuries. For decades, scholars assumed that the Maritime Silk Road, the sea route linking the Middle East to China, did not open in a serious way until the Song dynasty around the 10th or 11th century. The written records were vague, and most evidence pointed to overland routes through Central Asia as the primary channel for goods like silk and spices. The Belitung wreck proved otherwise. It showed that by the 800s, Arab merchants were sailing all the way to Chinese ports, loading their dhows with ceramics that would never survive a land journey. The ship itself was a marvel of design. Its planks were not nailed together, but sewn with cords made from coconut husk, a technique that gave the hull flexibility and resilience on long ocean passages. That sewing method, unique to the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea, allowed the dhow to ride out storms that would shatter a rigid European vessel. The cargo was packed with astonishing care. The bowls were nested inside larger jars and surrounded by packed straw. a system that protected fragile pieces across thousands of miles of rolling ocean. The sheer scale of the shipment, over 60,000 pieces, meant that trade was not a trickle of luxury goods. It was a steady, organized flow of manufactured products. Chinese potters were producing for an export market, and Arab merchants were willing to risk open-sea voyages that could last months. The discovery forced a complete redrawing of the economic maps of the early medieval world. The Silk Road was not just a set of dusty caravan trails. It was a maritime network that connected Guangzhou to Baghdad, with stopovers at ports in modern-day Vietnam, Malaysia, Sri, and Oman. The Belitung ship had sailed from China, probably from the port of Guangzhou, down the coast of Southeast Asia, across the Bay of Bengal, and along the Indian coast before it sank off the island of Belitung near Sumatra. That route matched descriptions in the works of the 9th-century Arab traveler Al, whose writings had been dismissed by some historians as exaggeration. The wreck proved he was describing a real, operating system, but the discovery also ignited a bitter debate over how the past should be treated. The Indonesian government allowed the wreck to be salvaged by a commercial company, and the entire cargo was sold to a private collector in Singapore. Critics argued that the artifacts were ripped from their context, that the seabed around the ship held crucial information about how the vessel sank, how the cargo was stowed, and how the crew lived. That context, they said, was lost forever when the ceramics were pulled up without careful documentation. The ship itself, the sewn planks, the ropes, the fragments of the hull, were not preserved or studied in detail. The trade maps may have been rewritten, but the price was the loss of a primary source, a time capsule that could have answered questions about construction, navigation, and daily life on a 9th-century dhow. Supporters of the sale argued that the artifacts were saved from decay and are now on public display in Singapore, where millions can see them. They point to the exhibition as a success, a rare chance for the general public to connect with an early chapter of globalization. But the debate remains unresolved, and the Belitung shipwreck stands as a cautionary tale about the tension between preservation and commerce. What is certain is that this single vessel, laden with Chinese bowls sewn into an Arab hull, shattered the old timeline and forced historians to redraw the earliest maps of global trade. It proved that the world was connected long before the age of exploration, and that the sea was never a barrier. It was always a highway. Some shipwrecks are found through years of searching. Others are stumbled upon by accident. In 2007, a pipeline survey in the Gulf of Mexico was mapping at 4,000 feet when the sonar picked up a shape that did not belong to geology. The team brought in remotely operated vehicles to investigate, and what they found forced a complete rethinking of early American maritime history. The vessel turned out to be from the early 19th century, a period when the Gulf was a highway for commerce between the young United States and the Caribbean. But the cargo told a different story than the official records. The remotely operated vehicles recovered bottles, ceramics, navigational instruments, and even organic remains like seeds and fabric that had survived because the cold, dark, oxygen-poor water at that depth prevented decay. The most telling artifacts, however, were the weapons. The ship carried cannons and a large number of muskets, far more than a typical merchant vessel would need for defense. That detail pointed to a different identity. This was likely a privateer or a smuggler, a ship operating outside the official channels of trade. Historians had long assumed that Gulf commerce during this era was dominated by legitimate merchants, honest traders moving cotton, sugar, and manufactured goods between New Orleans, Havana, and the ports of Mexico. The Mardi Gras shipwreck proved otherwise. It showed that a parallel economy existed, one built on privateering and smuggling, where ships carried cargo that never appeared in port records and answered to no government. The discovery was remarkable not just for its location, but for how it came to be studied. The pipeline company that found the wreck did not simply report it and walk away. They partnered with academic institutions, funding a full excavation and preservation effort. That collaboration between industry and academia became a model for how accidental discoveries should be handled. Organic materials like seeds and textiles were especially valuable because they rarely survive in shallow wrecks where currents and organisms break them down quickly. At 4,000 feet, the conditions were perfect. The team recovered items that offered a direct window into the daily lives of the crew, what they ate, what they wore, how they passed the long hours between voyages. There were even traces of coffee and pepper, luxuries that hinted at the ship's connection to global trade networks. The Mardi Gras shipwreck proved that even a find made entirely by chance could reshape our understanding of forgotten chapters of history. It stood as a reminder that the ocean does not only guard the treasures of ancient empires. It also holds the secrets of more recent times, just as hidden and just as revealing, waiting for a pipeline survey, a fishing net, or a curious diver to bring them back into the light. In 1993, a team located the Lusitania 11 miles off the coast of Ireland. The British ocean liner had been torpedoed by a German submarine in 1915, sinking in 18 minutes and taking over 1,100 people with it. For decades, the official story was straightforward. A single torpedo struck the starboard side, and the ship went down quickly. That narrative served as powerful wartime propaganda, painting the attack as an act of indiscriminate violence against civilians. But the wreck told a different story. When divers and remotely operated vehicles examined the hull, they found evidence of a second explosion, one that came from inside the ship. The torpedo had hit near the bow, but the damage pattern suggested a much larger blast amidships, tearing open the hull from within. Condition of the wreck, lying on its side with its bow deeply embedded in the seabed, supported that theory. Something had detonated inside the Lusitania after the torpedo struck, something powerful enough to break the ship's back. That finding reopened a debate that had simmered for decades. Was the Lusitania secretly carrying military supplies? The British government had always insisting the ship carried only passengers and civilian cargo, but the physical evidence from the wreck hinted otherwise. The location of the blast aligned with the area where the cargo holds were located, and the debris field contained fragments consistent with artillery shells and small arms ammunition. Historians began to re-examine the official records, and they found that the Lusitania had been listed as an auxiliary cruiser, a designation that allowed it to carry war materials under certain conditions. The controversy forced a fundamental shift in how historians approached wartime evidence. The official narrative, which had been accepted for decades as fact, was revealed to be shaped as much by propaganda as by truth. The Lusitania discovery taught scholars to question all sources, especially those produced during conflict, and to weigh physical evidence from wrecks against written records that might have been deliberately altered. The debate over the cargo is unlikely to be resolved completely, because the wreck itself has deteriorated significantly in the cold Atlantic currents. But the Lusitania remains a powerful reminder that even the most famous disasters are rarely as simple as history books make them seem, and the ethical questions it raised have not faded. Modern expeditions now tread carefully, balancing the desire for answers with the need to respect a site where more than 1,000 people lost their lives. The Lusitania continues to inform discussions about how we treat war relics, whether they belong to archaeologists, to governments, or to the families of those who never came home. In the early 1980s, fishermen off the coast have pulled up something that did not belong in their nets. Rusted blades, broken armor plates, and the heavy remains of a wooden hull emerged from the seabed. Archaeologists soon realized they had stumbled onto a piece of history that had existed only in legend. This was part of the invasion fleet sent by Khan against Japan in 1281, a massive force of thousands of ships that was destroyed by a powerful storm. For centuries, Japanese accounts spoke of a divine wind, a kamikaze, sent by the gods to protect the islands from the Mongol armies. Many Western historians dismiss the story as patriotic myth, too convenient and too symbolic to be true. The wreck proved otherwise. The excavation revealed a stunning array of weapons and armor, far more sophisticated than what scholars had expected from the Mongol navy. There were iron helmets, lamellar armor plates, and swords of a type that blended Chinese and Korean forging traditions. The hull section that survived showed advanced joinery techniques, including iron nails and reinforced bulkheads, a design that was far sturdier than the simple river boats that historians had imagined. The sheer variety of the wreckage told a deeper story. The Mongol fleet was not a single, unified force. It was assembled from shipyards across the vast empire, from the Yangtze River in southern China to the coasts of Korea. Each region contributed its own shipbuilding traditions. Some vessels were flat-bottomed river craft, never meant for open ocean, while others were sturdy sea-going junks with multiple masts. The mix reflected the logistical challenge of mounting an invasion across the sea, a challenge that the Mongols attempted to solve by throwing together every available ship. The storm did not just destroy a fleet. It caught a massive, disorganized armada at its most vulnerable moment, scattered and far from land. The artifacts recovered from the seabed allowed archaeologists to confirm the scale of the disaster. Thousands of anchors, ceramic shards, and human remains scattered across the painted a picture of sudden, overwhelming loss. The divine wind was not a myth. It was a real event, a typhoon that struck with devastating force, and the evidence was buried in the mud of bay. The discovery forced historians to rewrite the story of Mongol naval power. For decades, the accepted view was that the Mongols were a land-based empire with little maritime capability, that their fleets were crude and poorly built. The wreck showed that their ships were actually well constructed by the standards of their time, but they were simply no match for the open ocean and the fury of a typhoon. The wreck also revealed a key turning point in Japanese history. The failed invasions of 1274 and 1281, the samurai class as the defenders of the nation, and the legend of the divine wind became a foundational story of Japanese identity. That story, once dismissed by scholars as folklore, now had a physical foundation. The storm was real, and the ships it shattered were real. The discovery proved that even the most enduring legends can sometimes be grounded in truth, and that the seabed holds not just shipwrecks, but the raw material of national memory. The same cold waters that preserved the Mongol wreckage off Japan hold another mystery, one that haunted the British imagination for over a century and a half. In 1845, Sir John Franklin sailed from England with two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, to chart the final section of the Northwest Passage. Neither ship returned. For decades, the search for Franklin's expedition became a national obsession, spawning dozens of rescue missions and countless theories. Some blamed incompetent leadership, others pointed to starvation or scurvy. But the true story remained locked beneath the ice of the Canadian Arctic, until the wrecks themselves finally gave up their secrets. In 2014, a team from Parks Canada located the remains of HMS Erebus, resting in shallow water off the coast of King William Island. 2 years later, they found HMS Terror, lying in pristine condition at the bottom of a bay, its hull intact, its hatches closed, as if the crew had simply abandoned ship a moment before. The cold, dark water of the Arctic had preserved the vessels far better than anyone had a right to expect. Wood that would have rotted in temperate seas remained solid. Even the ship's bell was still mounted, its inscription legible. The discovery of the two wrecks changed the historical narrative dramatically. Earlier accounts had suggested that Franklin and his officers made a series of disastrous mistakes, that they were arrogant and unprepared. But the physical evidence painted a more complex picture of endurance and tragedy. The ships had not been crushed by ice, as many had assumed. Instead, they had been abandoned deliberately after being trapped for years in the frozen sea. The crew had sledged south, pulling heavy boats loaded with supplies across the ice, only to succumb to exposure and illness. But the most chilling revelation came from the analysis of the remains. Research suggested that the expedition's canned food, a new technology at the time, had been sealed with lead solder. That lead leached into the food over the long years of storage, slowly poisoning every man on board. The combination of lead poisoning, scurvy, and starvation had weakened the crew long before they abandoned the ships. The older stories, which blamed Franklin's supposed incompetence or the crew's breakdown into cannibalism, were oversimplified. The real story was one of systemic failure, a tragic convergence of flawed technology, extreme environment, and human endurance stretched to its breaking point. The wrecks themselves are now protected as National Historic Sites of Canada, preserved where they lie as monuments to the men who never came home. They also resolved a geographic mystery. The ships had reached the final leg of the Northwest Passage, confirming that Franklin's expedition had actually achieved its goal before disaster struck. The discovery turned a story of failure into one of quiet triumph and heartbreaking loss. The Arctic had kept its secret for 170 years. When it finally released the ships, it did not offer easy answers. It offered a deeper understanding of what the men endured, and a reminder that some mysteries are solved not by treasure, but by the slow, patient work of listening to what the ice has preserved. The waters off North Carolina hid a secret that challenged the official story of the Civil War. In the 1990s, a salvage team working near the mouth of the Cape Fear River located the remains of a steamship that had gone down in 1864. Local fishermen had known about the wreck for decades, but nobody had recognized its true identity. The vessel was the General, a British-built blockade runner that had been caught by Union warships while trying to slip into Wilmington with a cargo that never appeared in any Confederate manifest. When divers finally reached the hull, they found something far more revealing than a typical shipment of cotton or medicine. The holds were packed with British-made rifles, thousands of them, still stacked in their original crates. Cartridges, bayonets, and ammunition boxes filled every corner. The cargo was not a small, secret deal hidden in a few barrels. It was a full-scale military resupply, ordered directly from British manufacturers and shipped across the Atlantic under false papers. For decades, historians had debated how much foreign support the Confederacy actually received. The official records of the British government showed a stance of neutrality, with legal restrictions on arms sales to either side. But the general proved that the reality was far different. The rifles on board were patterned muskets, the standard British infantry weapon of the era, produced in London. They were identical to the guns used by the British Army. The ammunition was manufactured to the same specifications. This was not a trickle of surplus weapons from a distant war. It was a steady, organized pipeline that supplied the Confederate forces with the most modern firearms available. The sheer volume of the cargo, over 15,000 rifles in a single shipment, meant that entire divisions of Southern soldiers were armed with British weapons. That changed the way historians understood the balance of power during the conflict. The Union blockade was supposed to strangle the South into submission, but the general showed that the blockade runners were far more effective than anyone had realized. They were not bringing in luxury goods or minor contraband. They were delivering the tools of war on an industrial scale. The discovery also triggered a legal battle that lasted for years. The salvage company that found the wreck claimed ownership under maritime law, pointing to the investment of time and money required to locate and excavate the site. The state of North Carolina argued that the ship lay in state waters and that its historical significance meant it belonged to the people, not to private interests. The federal government weighed in, asserting that the wreck was part of the national heritage and should be preserved as an archaeological site. The case dragged through the courts, with each side presenting arguments about who had the right to recover and profit from the artifacts. In the end, a compromise was reached. The salvage company was allowed to retain a portion of the recovered cargo, but the majority of the rifles, ammunition, and other artifacts were placed in public museums, where they could be studied and displayed. That resolution set a precedent for how Civil War wrecks would be treated in the years that followed, establishing that the historical value of such sites often outweighed the commercial potential. The preserved artifacts from the general now sit in climate-controlled storage facilities and museum galleries. Researchers have used them to study the markings on the rifles, the stamps on the ammunition boxes, and the labels on the shipping crates. Those tiny details have allowed historians to trace the supply chain back to specific factories in Britain and to identify the middlemen who arranged the deals. The records of the blockade runners were often destroyed to avoid prosecution, but the physical evidence from the wreck provided a paper trail that no burned ledger could erase. It showed that foreign support for the Confederacy was not a minor footnote. It was a critical factor that prolonged the conflict and shaped its outcome. The general did not just tell a story of one ship. It revealed a hidden economy, a shadow network of arms dealers, shipping agents, and bankers who operated outside the law and outside the official histories. And it raised a lasting question. If one blockade runner carried this much evidence, what other ships lie on the, still holding the documents and cargo that could rewrite the official narratives of the past? The ocean does not forget. It holds on to the truth, waiting for someone to come and read it. A controversial claim in 2014 centered on the remains of Christopher Columbus's flagship Maria. A team of underwater archaeologists announced that they had located the wreck off the northern coast of Haiti, resting in shallow water near the site where Columbus had established his first settlement. The evidence they presented was a ballast pile, a mound of stones used to stabilize the ship, along with iron bolts and a few pieces of wood. To the team, these features matched descriptions from Columbus's own journal of where the Maria ran aground and was abandoned in 1492. The announcement made headlines around the world. If confirmed, it would be one of the most significant maritime discoveries in history, a direct link to the moment Europeans first set foot in the Americas and began a process that reshaped the planet. But almost immediately, other experts pushed back. They pointed out that ballast piles are common on Caribbean reefs, left behind by countless ships over centuries. The iron bolts could have come from any vessel of the colonial era, and the wood fragments were too degraded to be dated with certainty. The exact location, they argued, did not align perfectly with the distances Columbus recorded in his log. The ensuing debate was fierce. Some archaeologists defended the identification, pointing to the size of the ballast pile and its position relative to known features of the coastline. Others dismissed it as wishful thinking, a case of fitting evidence to a desired conclusion. The controversy forced historians to step back and ask a more fundamental question. How much do we really know about the first colonial voyages? Much of what we accept as fact comes from Columbus's own writings, which were written partly to impress the Spanish crown and partly to justify his claims. The Maria itself was not a large ship. It was a small merchant vessel, about 60 feet long, carrying fewer than 40 men. It sank because the lookout fell asleep and the ship drifted onto a reef, a detail that Columbus recorded in his journal but that many scholars had dismissed as a story for the crew. The wreck debate, whether or not the team had actually found the Maria, shifted the focus from certainty to probability. Historians began to treat Columbus's accounts not as literal records, but as documents shaped by politics, ambition, and personal bias. The controversy also changed how archaeologists approached early contact sites. Instead of relying on single pieces of evidence like a cannon or a ballast pile, they developed more rigorous criteria for identification. They demanded ceramic typology, dendrochronology, and cross-referencing with multiple historical sources. They recognized that the remains of early European ships in the Caribbean are often indistinguishable from later wrecks unless there is clear, contextual proof. The Maria claim, even if eventually disproven, became a cautionary tale that raised the standards for an entire field. It reminded everyone that the past does not give up its secrets easily, and that the easiest explanation is often the wrong one. In the end, the identity of the wreck remains unconfirmed. The debate continues, and the site off Haiti remains a subject of study rather than a settled chapter of history. But the most lasting effect was not about that one ship. It was about the way historians now approach the entire era of early contact, with greater caution, deeper skepticism, and a recognition that even our most celebrated discoveries may rest on foundations that are more fragile than we once believed. The Maria controversy, uncertain as it was, shifted the ground beneath a whole field of study. It proved that even a discovery that fails to be confirmed can still change how we think. In 2016, a team of researchers lowered a remotely operated vehicle into the Black Sea, not knowing they were about to find the best preserved ancient ships ever discovered. The waters near the Bulgarian coast hide a strange secret. Below about 150 meters, the Black Sea contains a layer of water so devoid of oxygen that nothing can live there. No wood-boring worms, no bacteria that rot organic material, no currents to scatter debris. Anything that sinks into that zone stays exactly as it fell, sometimes for thousands of years. The team was mapping the seabed with sonar and high-definition cameras when the lights of their vehicle illuminated something impossible. A wooden hull, upright and intact, with its mast still standing and the rigging still coiled along the deck. The ship was a Greek merchant vessel from around 400 BC, the classical era of Athens and Sparta, and it looked like it could have sailed only yesterday. The details were breathtaking. The carved decorative elements on the stern, small figures and geometric patterns were still sharp. The rope lines, usually the first thing to rot, hung in loops as if the crew had only just tied them. The steering oar, a long blade used to turn the ship, was still mounted in its bracket. Nothing like this had ever been seen before. Every other ancient shipwreck found in the Mediterranean or the Aegean had been reduced to a scattered pile of amphorae and a few fragments of hull, because oxygen and organisms had consumed the rest. Here, the entire vessel remained. The discovery proved instantly that Greek ships were far more advanced than historians had assumed. For decades, scholars had relied on vase paintings and a few lines of text to imagine what a classical merchant vessel looked like. They had guessed at the size of the mast, the shape of the hull, the way the rigging was arranged. But the Black Sea wreck gave them the real thing. The mast was taller than expected, and the sail, though missing, would have been enormous for a ship this size. That meant Greek merchants were not hugging the coast, as many textbooks claimed. They were building vessels capable of crossing open stretches of the Aegean and the Black Sea itself, carrying cargoes of grain, wine, and olive oil over distances of hundreds of kilometers. The ship was not a fragile coaster. It was a purpose-built freighter, designed for sustained voyages. The team found several more wrecks in the same anoxic zone, each from a different period of history. There was a Byzantine ship from the medieval era, a Roman vessel laden with amphorae, and even a ship from the Ottoman period with its cargo of ceramic bowls still stacked in the hold. Each one was preserved with the same eerie completeness. The mast stood, the deck planks lay flat, and in one case, the carved name of the ship was still legible on a wooden plaque. The researchers did not disturb any of them. They used only cameras and sonar to map the sites, leaving the wrecks untouched in their cold, dark sanctuary. That decision set a new standard for deep-sea archaeology. It proved that the best way to study a perfectly preserved wreck is to let it stay perfectly preserved, to gather data without ever touching. The images and three-dimensional models produced by the robots gave historians more information than a full excavation ever could, because the context, the position of every object, the angle of every fallen spar, remained exactly as it had been for centuries. The Black Sea project did not just rewrite the history of Greek shipbuilding. It changed the way the world thought about preservation itself. The anoxic layer is a natural museum, one that has been operating for over 7,000 years, accepting ships from every era that sailed those waters. The oldest wreck found so far dates back to 400 BC, but the potential for even older discoveries is real. Bronze Age vessels from the time of the ship could be lying in deeper, older sediments, waiting for their cameras to arrive. The implications are staggering. Every ship that ever sank in the Black Sea below that oxygen-free line is still there, whole and waiting. The project proved that the ocean can be a time capsule, but only under the right conditions. And it raised a quiet, thrilling question. If the Black Sea can preserve ships this perfectly, what other bodies of water hold similar secrets? The Baltic Sea, the deep basins of the Mediterranean, the cold trenches of the Antarctic. The tools now exist to find them, to map them, and to study them without ever breaking the seal of their silent resting places. The Black Sea wrecks stand as the pinnacle of shipwreck preservation so far. They have already revealed the true sophistication of ancient seafaring, and they continue to yield new insights with every scan, every model, every analysis. They are not endpoints. They are open doors, leading into a past that is far more intact, far more vivid, and far more connected than anyone ever imagined. And as the robots descend into the darkness, what they bring back is not just wood and rope. It is proof that the stories we thought we knew are only the beginning. These 25 shipwrecks, from a Bronze Age merchant laden with African ivory to a Greek vessel resting upright in the Black Sea, have done more than fill museum halls. They have forced a quiet revolution in how historians think. Each discovery pulled a hidden thread, and when pulled, whole tapestries of the past unraveled and had to be rewoven. The ship proved that Bronze Age economies were global in scale, long before the word global had any meaning. The mechanism showed that ancient engineers built devices whose complexity would not be matched for over 1,000 years. The Viking ships from Fjord revealed that Norse seafarers were not reckless raiders, but master planners who designed vessels for every purpose. The Mary Rose gave us the intimate lives of Tudor sailors, their combs and their backgammon boards, their tools and their surgeries. The Whydah and the Queen Anne's revenge shattered pirate myths and replaced them with a picture of organized, ethnic communities operating under their own rules. The San and the redrew the scale of colonial wealth and the hidden economies that moved it. And the wrecks of the Black Sea, preserved in an oxygen-free cold, proved that the ocean can keep a secret for more than 2,000 years, delivering it whole and undamaged. Together, these discoveries share a single, powerful message. The past is not fixed. It is not a set of facts carved in stone. It is a living archive, and the largest portion of that archive lies beneath the waves. For every shipwreck found, dozens more remain scattered across holding cargoes that will rewrite chapters of history we thought we understood. The ocean does not forget. It holds onto the truth, waiting for the right question, the right technology, the right moment. And every time a wreck is found, that moment arrives again. A new piece of evidence emerges, and historians must go back to their old assumptions and test them once more. That is the real treasure buried in each hull, not the gold or the silver, but the hard, humbling lesson that what we know is always incomplete. The ocean is the largest museum on Earth, and it is still mostly unopened. If these 25 discoveries have taught us anything, it is that the next shipwreck could change everything. Thank you for coming along on this journey. If you want to join us for more stories of history hidden beneath the surface, please subscribe to the channel. And drop a comment below, tell us which one of these wrecks surprised you the most. The conversation does not end here. It only pauses, like the sea itself, waiting for the next discovery to rise.